Hello, this is John Reed, and I have commandeered one of my usual suspects, Josh Greenbaum. How we doing?
I'm doing good. Still got a pulse. It's been a long day.
Yes, we're in my Las Vegas residency in the suite that I managed to finagle by complaining about my room. How about that?
It's quite the place. It's palatial, definitely.
Indeed. But we're not here to talk up my accommodations. We're here to dissect SAP Spend Connect. And SAP's got a pretty broad and vast spend management portfolio that we now need to make sense of, Josh.
Yeah, it's to say it's a hodgepodge is maybe unfair, but there's a lot of moving parts for sure.
And just to kind of give listeners some context, this is a big area for SAP. This is one of the biggest investment areas in the whole portfolio. We were told today it's second only to SAP ERP in terms of investment in. So, of course, that also ratchets up a little bit of the pressure in terms of results out, but that makes it an interesting area to care about. And you've been in on this for a while. You've actually kind of got my attention even a couple of years ago when you started blogging a couple of pretty meaty blog posts around why you think this is a really strategically important area for SAP. So can you just kind of tell us how you started getting more engaged around this topic? Because historically it was kind of like, okay, SAP acquired Ariba, they can do some indirect procurement or whatever. And it's changed so much. So what is your take on like why it matters?
Well, I think in 2 words, business network. And this to me is what is so important about how SAP's approach is. So you're right. They acquired Ariba and set out to, really establish that brand as an important component in SAP's strategy, focused on the traditional buyer for Ariba, which was a procurement clerk, a procurement officer. But what has been happening over the years and this is a homegrown effort as opposed to an acquisition, which is the rest of this portfolio is mostly acquisition. SAP's really been looking at how do you capture the complexity of the business transactions, particularly B2B transactions, in a network kind of economy. And they've built this multi-headed beast called Business Network, which is really their attempt to capture, again, the end-to-end processes that take place between business buyers of both direct and indirect supplies. And while over the years, they've sort of defaulted to the indirect materials market, which is, of course, this traditional procurement market, the robustness of Business Network has continued to grow and to be more and more attractive to folks in the direct materials world. They extended it in 2 other ways. So Business Network wasn't just about how you procure stuff. It also, they created originally what was called the Logistics Business Network, which was specifically for exactly what it sounds like, for actually allowing customers to find logistics providers to meet the particular requirement in global trade, and of course for these logistics suppliers to be discovered and contracted with. And they also had another network called the Asset Management. I'm going to get that wrong. But it was an asset management network.
A lot of networks to keep track of.
Yeah, well, that's why they consolidated. But the basic idea was that to help companies that own complex strategic assets to get them serviced, to get them managed in a strategic network way. Because if you're running a factory, you've got some major mill or press going into your factory. That's something that you need to maintain. It's very expensive. You need specialized parts, specialized help. And so they built a logistics business network around that. They consolidated all of this recently into the business network. So within that context of business network, you have the ability to procure as the buyer things you need based on looking at a catalog of potential suppliers that has become richer and richer, allowing you to have more specific sources of the things you need. And conversely, obviously, if you're a supplier, it allows you to broadcast one to many. I'm on a business network once. I, in theory, do what it takes to be on that network once, and I'm visible to all the buyers, potential buyers on the network across multiple different kinds of supply chains across these different functional areas like logistics, like asset management. So this has been a growing capability. In fact, I'm shocked we discovered how much it's been growing in the recent years. They mentioned that that $6.2 trillion worth of commerce flowed through the business network in the last year. And when I look back at my notes in 2018, Ariba Network had 1.8 billion, 1.8 trillion, flowing through it. That's a pretty dang significant growth rate and very, very impressive to me because it shows on the one hand, this potential to realize a real business network is there. They're succeeding. They're doing something no one else in the industry can do. On the other hand, it also points to the fact that this is yet another unsung hero in the SAP portfolio, because that kind of growth and that kind of value isn't reflected in most of what Wall Street thinks about SAP, and to a large extent, a lot of the customers who just are ERP customers don't see this either.
Right. And there's a potent question for SAP there too, which is kind of like, why aren't we hearing that story a little more boldly? And also, why aren't we seeing a really big bump in terms of Wall Street numbers when you have that much money flowing through? And of course, that's been a big focus of Spend Connect this year is kind of delivering more value around that to customers and making more noise. And at the moment, we're taping at the end of one full day, and then we had kind of a analyst NDA half day thing. So, and then tomorrow is another full day. So we're kind of like halfway through, but we have covered all the news. If you look it up online, there's a lot of news stories. They're all lifted. So you can check those out. And then we throw into the mix, right? Other acquisitions, Fieldglass, Concur, Talia, which has to do with trade finance. So, and you wrote a really interesting piece a couple of years ago. I recommend folks look up on the Talia piece of it. So, but when I think part of the frustration for me originally with this was hearing folks talk about the business network from the keynote stage in such grandiose terms without really understanding what it means. But it starts to get a little sharper now, right? You're feeling there's a sharper, more persuasive view of this now in terms of SAP.
I think the story is gelling. The business network concept always suffered from one fundamental flaw, primarily when you look at it from a vendor standpoint or from a customer standpoint. There's no VP of business network. There's no buying center that is solely focused on this concept, because this concept of a business network touches multiple parts of it. We just met with a customer, Molex, and I asked him, how did you folks come to this decision and he said, well, we talked to the quality people, we talked to finance people. It touches so many parts of a business that it doesn't have a traditional single point of contact. The VP of sales for CRM, the CHRO for HR, the ERP, the ERP buyer's the classic, whether that's in the CIO's office or in operations. So it's to have that fundamental problem of who's my buyer, who do I sell to? And it's also been the underlying problem at the customer side is that in order to really benefit from a business network, you have to bust down those silos. You have to have that cross-process view, because that's what it's doing, is delivering these collaborative end-to-end processes across your entire internal and external supply chain. So it's been a hard problem to articulate. It's been a hard problem to solve, and it's been a hard problem to find that buying center and that simple, easy message. It's not simple.
So I'll tell you a couple of things that were on my mind heading into the show, and then I'd love to hear kind of what you were looking at, because I know you've done a lot of research documenting some of the processes that SAP is trying to address here. A couple of things that were on my mind heading into the show is, to what extent can the so-called business network be greater than the sum of its parts? Because that starts to get really exciting to me when I think about, like for example, today I saw a lot of blur between indirect and direct materials, and that's just the beginning of all that. But that's important, because in the past there was always this distinction where direct materials were kind of elusive and not part of this. And then, everything from, being able to kind of locate suppliers across different regions easily. And then, being able to have that fluidity of going from, automating expense stuff versus procuring talent, like it all becomes part of the same conversation. So I'm kind of looking for that. I'm looking for how does this help SAP customers that have already made a big ERP investment? So can they build on that? That's another thing that I've been looking at. And one of the things that I also really was interested in coming into today was this whole thing around, is it possible that the business network can be something of a gateway drug to getting innovative with SAP? Because right now, I think sometimes for ERP customers, it's a little daunting because it appears to them like they need to make big decisions around S/4HANA migrations or cloud or rise or grow. And some customers are obviously making those decisions and going ahead. But if for whatever reason you're not quite ready, how can you get a taste of what SAP has to offer? And I'm really interested in that. So those were just a few of the questions I was kind of batting around. How does that resonate with some of the things you're thinking about?
Well, and the answer, the answer to the first and the last question really, particularly, how does this additive, how is this accretive to SAP and its customers, and is this a gateway drug? Really is answered by looking at the built-in integration that's innate to the business network, something SAP struggles to talk about, though we heard it from keynote stage today. Tasha Thurman did say, if you're not running SAP, we've got your back, we can help you. But the essential thing is, the Ariba network was built on a backbone of non-SAP customers as much as it was anything else. SAP being a dominant ERP vendor, there was a ton of SAP in there, but when they acquired that company, it was maybe 50-50 SAP and non-SAP. Its legacy as an integration-friendly application has continued, and while those ratios have diminished, they've not in any way gone away. The way this becomes cumulative or accretive to both SAP and the customers is that if I'm a company and if I want to buy on the network and I have multiple buying centers, I can start with Ariba sitting in my headquarter enterprise, working against an SAP ERP system. I know what I need to buy, and coming out of SAP, I know how to manage the orders that way. But I can then add into other buying centers that may not be running SAP ERP because Ariba lets me do that, and therefore the business network lets me do that. So I can start building out this one capability of how do I centralize or at least standardize buying in my enterprise because of the connectivity on the buy side. Similarly, on the supply side, now as a supplier, I actually don't need to be running SAP to be able to sell into the business network. They make that relatively easy for me to work at. So as a buying entity, particularly a large company, again, we talked to Molex, who had, what was the number? It was, it's leaving my head now, many thousands of suppliers.
Right.
This is hugely important for a company like Molex to be able to say, hey, come on board this thing. It doesn't matter what you're running. We will together gain value. We as Molex, obviously, because you're there, we can buy from you easily. But you as the supplier can come in and not just sell to us. Once you're in the business network, you can sell to anybody. So
right.
So I think that ability to integrate allows that bilateral kind of value to exist. And the other thing, then, in terms of the gateway drug, well, this is a great place for companies. Business network is a great place for companies to get a taste of the real business AI that SAP is running without necessarily running S/4HANA. And this is something you and I talk about a lot.
Yeah.
Inside the business network, there's a lot of great predictive AI capabilities SAP's been building for years. It's there. You can be part of it. There are certain aspects to Gen AI capabilities like Joule that are available inside Business Network or will be.
Well, and some of the interesting stuff, I think, with Gen AI and business networks, and I've been critical of a lot of overreach on Gen AI, but I do think there's a lot of mundane, busy work in procurement that does start to feel appealing with the Gen AI scenarios. Things like, they were looking at some expense stuff through Concur, like automating expense reports. It's hard to argue with stuff like that. It's hard to argue with all the, the backbreaking documentation that can be involved in some of these supplier transactions. So there is definitely some
writing
stuff to go after.
RFP,
yeah.
If you're a smaller supplier, that's great. You don't have to be an expert at the minutia of RFP responses.
Right. So there's a number of things that I liked today that I wanted to touch on and see what you thought, but I do want to hit on a couple things that I didn't like as well, and I want to get back to Molex in a sec. But one thing that I think SAP could stand to shift a little bit is I'm seeing a little too much of the suite first messaging at SAP events, and I struggle a lot with suites. I don't hear customers asking for suites. I don't ask for suites. I understand what SAP is trying to do. They want to make sure that no matter where you are with SAP products, that there is kind of a coherency in both the user experience and the data exchange and stuff. So I get that. But I think what we lose sometimes there is this notion of, first of all, the composable part of the suite, like how partners can get involved building stuff, how customers can get involved. Suite implies you're going to build it all yourself for your customers. I think that's a really legacy message. Sorry, SAP, if you're listening. The other thing that concerns me a little bit about it is that I think it underplays SAP's willingness to work with other software components that might be operable in these larger enterprise segments. And you've written about this. This is your whole heterogeneous landscape pitch, which is core to how you view the enterprise. And I think SAP is really underplaying its capabilities in this area, including around the spend portfolio, where in fact, even things like the control tower, dashboarding are going to be able to incorporate a lot of non-SAP data, which is hugely important, which came up in the Goldman Sachs thing in the keynote today. So there is some of that, but I just think the messaging really needs to shift a little more towards open platform and away from this suite concept. I just don't think it, to me, I don't like it.
But, unfortunately, I think what drives this if it's sometimes it feels a little desperate, the desperate need to sell RISE to Wall Street, to sell S/4HANA upgrades, that, and that everyone's supposed to kind of, toe the line here. Our main business by Wall Street's metrics, SAP's main business is S/4HANA. And so you have to that has to be the message first and foremost. Again, Atasha credit her for saying, and we're going to support you, whether you're running SAP S/4HANA or not,
right,
and other things. But yeah, it's doesn't come out strong enough. There isn't enough of it.
Right.
I 100% agree. And I think the world is a heterogeneous world.
It is.
Even within the customer base of even in these customers that SAP says are their core customers, they're running all kinds of non-SAP stuff all the time.
And part of this comes from a little bit of my bias coming to a number of fall events where most of the keynotes featured what you might call strange bedfellows of competitors of that vendor that are cooperating in certain ways. And I think that's what customers really want to see right now, not like all SAP all the time. So that was one thing that I had an issue with. I'll get to the other one in a sec, but before I do that, I do want to talk about like a couple news things that I liked, and one of which you and I dug into a lot, which was Promote, which has been around a little bit for a while, but it's going to be really more formalized in Q1 of next year as a broader offering. And a lot of this speaks to something I think you and I both care a lot about, which is how can smaller suppliers punch above their weight in these networks and not get deluged by the friction of being involved and also not the lack of visibility. And Promote, like it sounds like, is specifically designed to give these suppliers a much greater ability to kind of show up in searches, be visible. For those listeners who are trying to picture it, there may be some interesting parallels to like LinkedIn Premium, which I've been a customer for a little while and then dropped, but like in terms of like the visibility aspects and stuff like that. And so I think that's really interesting because SAP really wants to improve the discoverability of suppliers. And I really like the foundation they're laying there. So I thought that was an interesting news announcement. And you and I actually hit the show floor and got some demos. What did you think?
And, you called it LinkedIn equivalent. I
called it a dating service.
It's a dating
right?
app.
Yeah.
And it's a dating app in all the good reasons. Those things exist, which is
we got to tread a little carefully, I think, with the dating analogies here. But yes,
yeah, right.
Yes.
Because the end goal is not monogamy; it's polygamy.
Okay.
And you want to.
Yeah, I was worried about this one, Josh.
I'll stop there. Okay, but the idea is, you want to be able to put your best foot forward as a supplier and make sure that folks know that you are compliant. With the right regulations, with the right systems. With the right everything. I mean, ISO 9000, you clearly, and no one wants to do business with a supplier that's having human rights violations. That's in the conflict, supply business. So you want to have those basics, but you also want to be able to really fine tune how you look to the network, whether you're performing, you said punch above your weight. You damn well better be punching above your weight. And one of the things this Promote will let you know is whether you're doing that or not, and where you're not doing it. That's a really huge thing for suppliers, because fundamentally, Business Network only succeeds if it has a critical mass of suppliers. End of story.
Right. Which has sort of been like the big challenge, and to really make it worthwhile for the suppliers to do that. And I like the sort of what I perceive as a smart and tasteful use of AI in this, where rolling it out gradually in the sense of like AI is going to start making some recommendations on how you can improve your profile. And these are kind of obvious things, right? Like get yourself verified, if maybe get an eco status thing on your profile, things like that for sustainability, like different things that might be screened for. But over time, as it gets more sophisticated, it's interesting to think about where it could lead, because it could give buyers the opportunity to, for example, screen on a very specific certification they're looking for, and you could be discoverable based on that in your profile. Like we talked with Molex about that, and he was definitely, as a buyer, really open to the idea that he could eventually screen on really granular things and connect with new ones. And then, of course, you could imagine so-called intelligent matching and see if an AI system can actually do better matching. What remains to be seen, but that's certainly a possibility. And so anyway, I think that's a really interesting announcement. And
yeah, I think ultimately, my favorite is, wouldn't it be great if I was so damn good in the network with on-time delivery, and that I could put that out there and show my network verified on-time delivery rate. I mean, that's the kind of thing, that's gold for both supplier and buyer, because a buyer that's the one thing they don't want, is a late delivery. And if they can, go with John Reed Incorporated, because they're so
always
much
on time, baby.
Yeah, right. Well, we journalists, we know how to do that. But that kind of those are exactly the kind of metrics that got me excited about Business Network in the first place. If all the commerce and transactions are taking place in this cloud environment where you can capture the data, then you can turn that into analytics and drive a ton of value to all sides of the business transaction.
Which was the other thing that was interesting. I mean, there were a bunch of news items, but the other one that I liked in the keynote was Warner Music talking about the SAP Spend Control Tower. And I liked the idea of pulling in disparate data sources into that one unified dashboard view. And you start to think about like gradually kind of really deriving deeper decision-making value from data. And so it seemed like it wasn't that hard for them to get up and running on that. And right now there's a few main sources that are going into that. I don't want to get in trouble and list the ones. I'm pretty sure like Ariba and Concur are part of the, but there's more coming basically. I think there's 3 now and more on the way. And so that was really cool also, because I just think like that type of visibility is really core to what SAP is trying to accomplish here. So
yeah, and right. It's so Spend Control Tower it benefits from the fact that there is a standard data set going into it. That is, they've been able to standardize the data. That's the whole idea. And therefore, this is everything we talk about in terms of AI and business analytics drives down to the question of, do you have standardized data that's normalized so you can use it, to both, understand the past and predict the future. And you need high quality. And that's what, these Spend Control Towers is based on that.
And so that ties into my first point I was making around what I was looking for. That's a greater than the sum of its parts example, right? Where you're standardizing all this data from different applications into one unified analytics environment. And I expect we'll see even more to come from that. I did want to correct, because I was able to find my note on that. Right now it's GA for Ariba, S4 and Fieldglass, and then in the upcoming release, I guess, what they call B1, I think it's called. And then in Q1 of next year, there will be Concur as well as external API integrations. You raised an interesting question around IBP.
Right. Right. Well, yeah. And I want to emphasize one point first that I missed, which is that one of the important things about the business network is its collaborative capabilities. And Molex is using, in particular, supply chain collaboration as one of the key components of it. Being able to get all these different stakeholders involved in buying and selling and in the logistics side of it.
Right.
And having them work from the same, literally from the same user experience is super important.
It is. I mean, it's amazing what happens with customers when they stop arguing about those numbers and stop comparing spreadsheets and actually work off this. It is a shift for sure.
So on the the integrated business planning question,
we have to tread a little carefully because I think part of that was under NDA.
Right. So. But what I will say, because it's public by its absence, is that the Business Network folks and the Spend Connect conference in general have really, again, focused on this indirect side of the coin, focused on, the procurement buyer, and therefore sort of left this core capability called business planning, and which is really the fundamentals for demand planning and supply chain execution off the table. IBP is a really super important product. It's part of the Business Network offering insofar as it's one of the tools you can use in this collaborative fashion to again look at the end-to-end process. Everything you buy is something someone else has to sell. Everything you build is something you have to plan for. And so I challenged Natasha, and she accepts the challenge to incorporate that story a little bit more in the future, because that's a very it's a super important part of the entire business network, is this integrated planning.
Indeed. So I think I'm getting towards the end of my big talking points. I did want to ask you've been kind of making a little bit of a stink at this conference around job titles and the use of the word spend. Is that something we need to get into at all?
I just, it's mostly about the fact that I look at the Ariba acquisition put the procurement professional in front of the spend story, and there is the supply chain professional who's part of that, and this tension between direct and indirect is at play in just how SAP has been messaging. So I'm a little uncomfortable with thinking that anybody wakes up in the middle of the night and thinking I need a spend management solution. That's a nomenclature problem. But I also want, I want to emphasize this, and it's sort of something I thought about today. There's a big fundamental difference between the indirect supply or the indirect supply side of the coin and the direct materials side of the coin. When you're procuring direct materials, at the end of that supply chain ultimately is a customer, someone who's you, and whether you're the entire end-to-end supply chain or only a component of it, there's an actual customer using something or getting something delivered. At the end of the indirect supply chain, it's usually an employee. So the strategic value is fundamentally different. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you can't run a company without indirect supplies, but how you impact customers, that link to the customer experience, is super important. So I think that when you look at how do you message, how SAP's messages and how the ecosystem is receiving this, there has to be some sensitivity to the fact that if you're in the supply chain management world, you cannot be a successful professional without remembering that at the end of the day, what you do impacts directly a customer, a patient waiting for an infusion, someone waiting for that package, to arrive, or a business waiting for that key supply so that they can build that widget to sell to their customers. Indirect has slightly different language because it has slightly different impacts. And I just want that, I want to see that resolved a little bit more so that we're talking to both sides in equal measure, because SAP can deliver to both sides in equal measure, and that's important.
Right. So my final gripe comes with a twist, because there's also a kind of big positive to come out of it. But prior to this show, I wrote a monster piece on vendors hyping AI agents to the point of absurdity. And one of my contentions in that piece is that I said, well, why are they doing that? And I said, A big reason they're doing that is because there's not a lot of sexy generative AI stories to talk about this fall in terms of live production customers that are kicking ass. So there's a void. But I said the void should actually be filled by more mature stories of customer results, not on puffery. And what I consider to be sometimes actually questionable assertions in terms of what AI is capable of from an agent and automation perspective, but that's kind of a different podcast. But I've been really looking for customers and vendors to really shift that and really make sure that some of the customers really achieving great results with current technology are getting more airtime, because I think it's really, really important for their fellow customers to see all the things that are possible right now with their current license and their current investment, not something that's coming someday or later that's going to revolutionize everything. And by the way, maybe take your job, which is the other part that isn't covered very effectively, although I question sometimes, how much jobs are really at stake. But the point is people worry about that.
Sure.
So anyway, we had an interesting example of that. I think this conference was definitely a lot less AI hype during the keynote for sure than what I saw.
Yeah.
So that was great.
Thankfully.
And very little talk of agents, although they will tell you, and Manoj talked with us about that, around how they perceive a lot of what they're building in with Joule to be agent related, but that's different. Anyway, what I wanted to mention is following that discussion, we had our sit down with Molex, and Molex is just a really super interesting customer and a great example, which I'll be writing about, of exactly what I'm talking about, that I think deserves a lot more airtime at shows like this. This is a company that I'll just read to you: digitalizes discrete PO, consignment PO, subcontracting PO, enabling 1,000 suppliers, 1 billion in transactions in 18 months. And talking with Tony from Molex, Tony Gainsford, it was really cool to hear that they're actually deriving a lot of benefits. And how did they get to 90% supplier adoption and all of that stuff? And what was cool about the story was you had a customer who has a big vision of wanting to really transform the whole procurement and sort of supply chain components that he touches, but also is realistic about the change process, which every customer goes through. And we had some really good talks around all that stuff. So I thought that was really cool and just a great example of the kind of customers I encourage vendors like SAP to make more noise with, because it's just a fantastic story.
Yeah, and what I loved about it is he was sort of stepping away a little bit from the advanced cool stuff that was on the stage, and not because he doesn't understand it necessarily, but because he's old school. And I love the fact that we ended that conversation with him talking about change management and how he said, yeah, you've got all this stuff going on. You got people, you got process, you got data, but none of that works without change management. And they set up centers of excellence. I mean, this is stuff our late great buddy
Michael Down, baby,
talked about centers of excellence ad infinitum, because this is old school stuff. It's been around for years and years. And here's Molex kicking it out of the park. I mean, these numbers are phenomenal. 200 million in spend per month. And they got it old school. They got it doing it the hard way.
But also with some really interesting twists, which is that technology becomes embedded in these conversations, but not necessarily AI all the time, but stuff that's a little more mature in some ways. So for example, how do you get people trained in this context? Well, you do it in Molex's case, with YouTube and TikTok videos, training 2,000 people without a single training session, 3 or 4 minute videos integrated through SuccessFactors learning management system. I mean, so you're talking change management, but with a twist that's appropriate for this generation and the type of work we have today. I think those are really, really good stories, Josh. That's all I'm saying. I just think they need more amplification is all.
Yeah, I think that's innovation. An innovative way to look at innovation. That's really a welcome view at this point.
Yeah, and then the other thing too is also talking around the S4 piece, because that was the other big question I had coming in is, are customers with deep SAP ERP investments getting more out of their spend investments as a result of that. And what we heard from Tony around their SAP ERP integration is he said the cloud integration with COG, which is the name of the integration into the business network, is he said he did most of it ourselves with very little help from IT. That God bless him. And he said, quote unquote, it's an amazing product. How often have you heard that around any integration toolkit on the market right now?
He was breathless about it. I mean, that was a real standout. We both wrote that quote down.
Yeah,
because the ease of use, the fact that it was the business side that developed it. I'm going to have to dig a little more deeper into that one. I want to hear more stories like that because that's phenomenal.
Absolutely. And thankfully he didn't use the word seamless integration, because I would have had to really seek some counseling if I heard a customer actually use that term and say that it actually was seamless, because seamless is just, I did hear that from the keynote stage once, unfortunately. I officially
handled it well. Yes.
I've officially banned that term from usage, but if a customer starts using it, then I will have to reconsider my ban. The final thing I just wanted to bring up, and you may have a couple final things as we wrap, but I thought the overall context of this conference was interesting, and it was brought up a couple of times in different sessions, and Natasha brought it up as well, that SAP is really well aware that a lot of the professionals at this conference are dealing with a different kind of geopolitical environment that's affecting their perception of what they need to do and how to manage risk. And these are really important conversations. And I know that it would be comfortable to leave the geopolitics out of all of this, but in fact, it really is a major, major factor, and it's not going to, I don't think, unfortunately, get easier or better. And it's forcing a lot of issues, including reevaluation of how you source everything in your enterprise and how you plan for redundancy in that sourcing and everything else. And so on the one hand, you have some pretty hard realities. Then you have, I think, this sort of like, there's some kind of business as usual in the middle, but it's getting harder and harder to just put your head down and say, I'm a procurement professional or something like that without thinking about any of this stuff. And then on the other hand, the more intriguing part to me is starting to think about these things not just as cost centers, but so-called value centers or whatever the hell you want to call them. The point being that you can be more strategic to your organization and not just getting expenses approved, but you can actually have real impact on your company's margins, not just your costs and stuff like that. So I think that whole framing is really interesting.
We went to a lunch in Workforce of the Future, and and this idea of what is this role look like? The geopolitics is absolutely essential. I mean, you can't be in the import business as a logistics provider or as anyone on the procurement side without having to watch out. What is the Biden administration going to do about China? And China, they're trying to change some of these import regulations, de minimis being an important one that has a huge impact on small goods traffic across borders into the United States. That's changing weekly.
What's there? I recall a quote from that was like, customer was anonymized, not to protect identities. Was like, what are you doing about China? I don't know. Like,
look at your data. What is your data telling you about China? I don't know. Well, that's not an appropriate answer anymore. You got to think this stuff through, because whatever it is,
not necessarily China. It's just one example, right?
China is only one of many, many examples. Price of oil. What's happening in the Middle East could impact the price of oil. What's happening, in geopolitics is going to hit you home. We are a deeply interconnected world now. No one can sit back and just hope that, there's somebody in Peoria who's going to be able to solve all your problems as a supplier. Those days are gone, unfortunately.
Right.
Or maybe fortunately.
So business as usual is not happening. And so, change is an imperative. And then SAP's job, I think, becomes to really be that partner, right? And really, really make that case that they can be a partner for that change. And so we'll see. It remains to be seen. Customers will evaluate, but certainly an interesting day. Do you have any final observations?
I'll just say that, to close this out where we started, the Business Network does provide that dual capability of being both the tool, the platform that you use to manage that complexity and that risk, but also manage the new opportunity. And I think that combination of sort of, minimizing the negative and maximizing the positive is something that again speaks to the value of Business Network overall. It's not perfect, it's not finished, it's a work in progress. And a lot of these capabilities are, still have to be both finished by SAP and then adopted en masse by a critical mass of suppliers. But the capabilities and the strategy are there, and it's one of a kind in the industry, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think my final takeaway was around there's two. One is the leadership team. I mean, Atasha Thurman's kind of a constant, and some folks saw her at Sapphire as well. I thought she really redeemed / salvaged the Sapphire keynote, but that's kind of a story for another time. But a lot of people are getting more familiar with her. But there's also a number of other executives that are in play here that are worth tracking.
Yep.
So I encourage folks to study the team a little bit, and then I thought it was really interesting with Molex too, where while he was not really getting into the analytics and AI stuff in the keynote, as I want to do this right now, he was poignantly aware that everything he's doing, like setting up the core fundamentals in his business and getting that infrastructure right around spend and getting it all sorted and integrated, was going to be the key to whatever quality analytics and AI are to follow.
In AI, yeah. Right.
And I think that's just a really good reminder that that's really where it begins, and that I think some companies are going to try to take shortcuts with Gen AI, and they won't have done this disciplined type of work that this company has done. And I think they're going to end up regretting that when they embark upon this journey, because I don't care whether it's SAP AI, Business AI, or any other kind of AI. If you haven't done this foundational work, I don't really like your chances, aside from really routine use cases. Yeah. So anyway.
No, you're absolutely right. All drives back to the data question.
Indeed. Shall we end it there?
That's a good place to start.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.